the more liberal party in England, but he's married to a Jew and is actually for the Labor Party very strongly in understanding Israel's security dilemma, and was one of the more supportive people of Israel in the Labor Party. Again, he's not Jewish himself; his wife is. I think maybe that's part of why he understands this, but the new person that's going to be taking over, Andy Burnham, is not a supporter of Israel, to say the least. He's not as bad as Jeremy Corbyn and some of the people that were potentially leaders. But what is very interesting is the next potential leader of the Tory party, of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, is a woman who's originally from Nigerian background. Married to a Scottish man, which is why she has a very Scottish last name. But she's very, very strong supporter of Israel. If she winds up being the next prime minister, it'll be very interesting to see what happens because it potentially will be, um, a much different situation. She's not gonna, she wouldn't win or campaign necessarily on her strength in support of Israel, but she's made it very clear, even for members of the Tory party, which are generally more supportive of Israel there. And in England, it's very different. England, for years, the Jewish community has been on the conservative Tory side. And remember, the Tories are not as conservative as American Republicans are, so to speak. So, it's not like, well, I don't want to get too political, but the reality is that it's not exactly the same as saying Tories are Republicans and Labor are Democrats. But even for members of the more conservative party, Kemi is much more supportive of Israel, is been steadfast in her support of Israel since October 7th. And if she does become the prime minister, I mean, they've already had two more women, by the way, of the six last prime ministers. Two of them were women in Britain, and but to have an African woman be the prime minister of England would be, I think, a pretty cool thing. But we'll see. Well, I definitely was it was interesting being there, and of course England lost today in the World Cup, so my family's a little sad. The British family is a little depressed today as they went down to an Argentina team that keeps beating people in the last minute. But yeah, they, as I told my family, you won the Falklands, so you can lose to Argentina every 10 years and or 20 years or whatever, grow up. But yeah, now my family is, well, they're done. But anyways, it was an eventful trip, and I again thank you everybody for joining. We got a nice group. We got some people here for the first time, so welcome to those who are here for the first time. The last couple of sessions before we left, actually the last couple of months, we really focused on Jewish history. We did a lot of history, and all of the history, all of those classes are up on our YouTube channel, and we actually have a very organized. And I'm going to put it up here for those who want to go back and look at some of those classes, especially those people who were. I'm not going to point at you, but if you were on our trip to Europe over the last couple of weeks, you can go back and look at some of the classes that we did on the history of Jews, because we did a 6-week series on the history of Jews from the biblical period all the way to the modern period, and then we did a special class just on the history of Jews of Europe and looking at Yiddish. And so those classes, really, the history classes started back in March. Oh, sorry, February, and then and the one on Europe and Ashkenazi. So kind of the Middle Ages. Sorry, the that was February 18th, class 20, and then the class where we just talked about Yiddish and Ashkenazi origins was the 8th of April, and then the 22nd of April we did a class on the Shoah, specifically on the Holocaust. So those classes, those classes from the last several weeks and months, I'm going to post them up here in the chat. But we also have we've been doing a lot of history of Jews and Christianity, history of Jews and Islam. So pretty much when I look back at what we've been doing over the last several months, really going all the way back to January when we did a couple classes on Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, also up there in January, we've really been focusing a lot on history. And we did a couple of sessions just before we left on American Jewish history, which I thought was important to do before the 4th of July and before and then while we were part of Jewish History Month in the United States. So so today we're going away from history. We're going into a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and that is Jews in space. And I laugh, of course, because when we hear Jews in space, of course, we go directly to Mel Brooks and the History of the World, Part One, where he hinted that he would do, or not hinted, he basically said that he was going to do the history of the world, Part Two, which they finally just came out with, of course. But he promised that there would be the Jews in space. There was no Jews in space, by the way, in the last History of the World series that he did. But he, you know, he kind of posited, at least in a very brief skit, at the end of History of the World, in the teaser for part two, that there's Jewish um, space fighters in the future, and of course there's also in the space fighter in the scene enemies and people who are trying to attack the Jewish space people. Um, that's an interesting idea, which is that somehow, unfortunately, anti-Semitism and the desire for people to destroy us might follow us all the way into space. I tried to find this book totally disappeared. It disappeared off my shelves and it's disappeared. It's disappeared from the internet. I've not. I know the book existed because I read the book back in the 80s. I used to be a big science fiction nerd. I mean, I'm still a nerd, but I was a science fiction nerd for most of my first 25, 30 years. I think partly because my wife has no patience for science fiction, that I stopped at least reading that. But I don't read it unfortunately as much, anyways. But I read every science fiction book that touched on Jewish subjects at all. And we're going to talk about Jewish sci-fi. But there actually was a book called Diaspora, it was called Diaspora, it was titled Diaspora, and it was exactly about that issue of Jews eventually deciding after, and this is set, you know, far enough in the future that we're doing long haul space travel. We're traveling outside of our solar system. The Jews eventually have to say, we got to get away from the planet. We've got to get away from anti-Semitism. And essentially, they go to another part of the universe to be left alone. And so the book, and again, I cannot find it. It's called Diaspora, I believe. I thought it was called, maybe it wasn't called Diaspora, but I looked it up, couldn't find it. I don't know where the book went. It was on my shelf just behind me somewhere at some point. I have other books on Jewish sci-fi. These are short stories called Jewish Futures, stories from the world's oldest diaspora. Here's a book called Other Covenants, which is it's alternative histories of the Jewish people. Not so much necessarily just science fiction about other worlds, but also, like what if this happened or this didn't happen? What if 6 million Jews were not murdered? Those kind of hypotheticals. But Jewish sci-fi is something that I want to get to. We will get to it, but first I want to talk a little bit about why this is such an important issue, and it really why spend any time talking uh, about this from a Jewish standpoint. And I'll tell you, to me, when we talk about what space means to us as Jews, I actually delivered a sermon 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I just looked back. It was September of 2006, and I did a sermon about Star Trek. Well, everybody called it the Star Trek sermon. And we actually had people who've told me, including members of our board, who've told me that they joined the temple because of that sermon. which I thought was interesting because, I don't think it was the most profound or um, maybe I didn't have, I think, great import for, it wasn't, definitely wasn't about politics or about Jewish survival, but it really was more about why space is always inspired, why the concept of the future and of space has inspired the Jewish people. And I'm glad it inspired people, but people remembered it because I talked about Star Trek. It was the 20th, it was 20 years ago. It was the 40th anniversary of the debut of Star Trek, which debuted in September of 66, which means this year is the 60th anniversary of Star Trek. So if you remember Star Trek, the original series, and you remember when it debuted, that was 60 years ago. That's 60 years in the past, which seems like a lot, right? And so I talked about that, and people thought it was interesting because a lot of people are interested in Star Trek, but it was really more of what Star Trek taught us and how it fits into. It was really not about Star Trek. It was really about the Jewish take on space. And I talked about my visit and my time with Ilan Ramon, the Israeli astronaut who perished along with the other six astronauts on the Columbia STS 107, which had happened in 2003. So it just happened a few years before. And so I talked a little bit about that, and I talked about as a backdrop for it. But I really talked about what we were going to talk about today in a little bit more of an interactive way, and a little bit more emphasis on like the facts, if you will, not a sermon. Um, and it's something again that I think is really it really is important. I will tell you that as I was preparing for today over the last several weeks, because I started preparing for this before I went away, I started thinking about maybe it's time to revisit this in a sermonic way. So don't be surprised if some of this, not what we talk about, but the whole backdrop of this might find its way back into the 60th anniversary of Star Trek, the 20th anniversary of my Star Trek sermon. So it's just hard to believe that was 2006. So let's let's take a look at let's take a look a little bit at the facts, if you will. And wait a second. Kelly just sent me something about the book. Uh, no, this is not the book, though this one now sounds like a really good book for me to read too. It's called Not for Glory, which just sounds like a basis of Joel Rosenberg did a book. The writer Joel Rosenberg did a book about basically a modern day Masada, a um, modern day version of Masada, or not a modern day, a future version of it. But we're going to get to sci-fi, I promise. But let's take a look first at this bigger issue of Jews in space. There's so much to can go off on. We could probably just do one session just about Jews and science fiction, because we are going to do one about Jews and comic books. That is coming up in the future. But I do want to talk a little bit about really where this starts from, and the concept of or at least the way I would phrase it, the idea of space and the stars and the heavens inspiring us goes back to the Torah. It goes back to the beginning. And of course, the stars and the heavens are created as part of creation. And there's this understanding that God created the universe and created the stars, which is by itself, of course, a recognition that it's a part of God's creation, just like we are, and just like our planet is, that there are that God created the heavens. Now, this was a little different from what other people taught even back then, even amongst like the people that we think of as really, really smart people, the Egyptians, the Greeks and Romans. Lots of other people had different teachings about the stars that we would say today are not very scientific, or almost anti-scientific, from the standpoint that they often would teach in some of these other traditions that the stars are actually deities, or what we call gods, that that are not only represented, and we know about constellations, those still we still know the constellations thousands of years later, but that these planets are actually and stars. I mean, they didn't recognize them as planets yet, but that these stars are actual divine beings, divine entities. And what's interesting about that is that to some extent that means that those stars and those entities have a will of their own, or they're not necessarily uh, subservient to a deity, or to a prime creator, if you will. Even if they have parents, even if these gods had parents, they're not necessarily, again, part of they're not a created entity, or part of something that we would call is a massive creation, which is pretty much what Judaism saw the heavens as from the very beginning, from creation. There was also recognition almost from the beginning, from the book of Genesis, that the stars are there to inspire us. When Abraham is told by God to look up into the stars, to look at the stars, and when God tells Abraham, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, he's using the stars to teach this lesson that there are millions, and of course, now I sound like another great Jewish astrophysicist, Carl Sagan, who said, he says he never really said billions and billions, but that the stars are they're almost without count. And so when God says count them, and God knows he can't count them, when Abraham looks up at the sky, he sees the future. He sees his future. He sees us, and to some extent it becomes the metaphor for the symbol for the future, that we are the future. And what's amazing about that is that when we now combine that with our understanding, especially the understanding we've had over the last 100 or so years of incorporating a desire to understand the universe. And I mean, there are always people who wanted to try to figure out information about the stars, whether it was Galileo or Copernicus or Ptolemy 2,000 years ago. But when somebody looks up at the sky and says, you know what, we want to know more about this, which has definitely been a big part of human history over the last 200 years, what we see is this understanding that Judaism has always been there. Our tradition has always been, yeah, that's where the future is. That's where possibility is, and that's where, even if God creates this reality, um, it's something for us to know, and we can know it. We can learn more about it. So there is a program that was made recently on PBS. It is hosted by the inheritor, and he will tell you he is the inheritor of Carl Sagan. And well, somebody was about to say something, that when we talk about people who've popularized science and popularized uh, astronomy in particular, in a previous generation, it was Carl Sagan. And today, when we think about those people who kind of have taken over the mantle of from Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson would be that guy. And I'm going to show you a little bit in a moment, a clip from something they called Fiddler on the Moon, which was done again. It was shown on PBS, and is dealing with this idea that we have, uh, that Judaism has always had this innate curiosity and openness about learning more about the stars. So it starts in the Bible, and even by the time, and we've talked about the Talmud, we've of course had Talmud classes over the years. I want to share with you something that we have in the Talmud, and an understanding that because traditional Judaism will always be rooted in the Torah and then in the Talmud, I'm going to share with you a little text from the Talmud, which tells us a little bit about what we thought about the stars during the Talmudic period, the rabbinic period, which we're talking about 2,000 years ago. So this is a tractate of the Talmud, a section called Avodah Zarah, which basically deals with primarily, and of course, every section of the Talmud deals with something and then really doesn't deal with it deals with a whole lot more than what you think it's going to deal with, because it goes off on some pretty wild tangents. There's an interesting question in the Talmud that they ask, which is, what does God do at night? What does God do when we're asleep? Okay, now you might have wondered, you know, maybe does God do other stuff other than take care of us and our planet? Well, the Talmud asks that question, and it says, what does God do at night? Now, you could say, you know, maybe it's exactly the same stuff that he does during the day. He does it at night. He's got, business to do. But maybe what God does is he rides on his light cherub. A cherub is the kruvim are not little friendly angels with baby faces. They're actually big mythical beasts that fly with wings and have a lion's body and very big, eagles type wings. That God rides around on the cherub and flies in 18,000 worlds. Because there's a line in Psalms, of course, it's got to be based on somewhere in the Bible. The chariots of God are 20,000, even Shinan, even thousands. Do not read it as even Shinan, read it as that which are not Shinan. And this is again how the rabbis are going to derive this. Since the minimum of thousands is 2,000, the phrase that which are not thousands indicates that 2,000 are not present. That is, the chariots of God are 20,000 minus 2,000, which means that God rides in 18,000 worlds. Now, of course, 18 we know has got symbolic resonance, symbolic numbers, but they're actually subtracting it out of 20,000. And that they kind of come up with this, there's 18,000 worlds. And if you wish to say instead that God sits and listens to the songs out of the mouths of angelic creatures, as it is stated by the Lord will command his loving kindness, and in the night his song shall be with me. And that's also from Psalms. So maybe God listens to the angels sing, or maybe God is out riding through the other worlds. Now, it's not a lot. It's not very, maybe we'd wish there'd be more about what happens on those other worlds. But this text, folks, allows Jews thousands of years later, including again Orthodox Jews, Dati Jews, were very religious Jews, Hasidic Jews, modern Orthodox Jews, ultra Orthodox Jews, to say the Talmud seems to be talking about God going to other planets and that there is life on other planets. So, for example, here's a site that a lot of people would go to for information on Orthodox Judaism, which is Aish Torah. And Aish Torah basically starts to say, and again, posing the question, is there life on other planets? Of course, quotes this text, which is right here. God flies through 18,000 worlds. So there's a text, and that's all people need. That's all the people who are looking at the text need, which is, oh, so there's a possibility, there's at least this idea that God has other habitable worlds. Now, why is this important? Why does this why are we having even this discussion? Because not only does it open up a deep theological question, which is, if there's life on other planets, is it God's life? Did God create that life? Well, the Jewish answer would be yes, of course. God created life throughout the universe. And so God creating life on other planets is completely reasonable. It becomes a bigger issue with other faiths. Primarily, one could argue, with Christianity and with Islam, because both of those faiths are to some extent answering other questions besides the initial questions that Judaism answered. Because both of them could say, well, the Bible says this, and so there's where it lies. But because Christianity opens up an interesting question, which is, but Jesus came to save humanity. Did Jesus go to other planets? And that opens up a very difficult question, which Christianity is not does not have a uniform answer. Now, I don't want to say that Judaism has uniform answers for all the questions that have to do with what would happen if there was life on other planets. And of course, the succeeding question is, what if we are eventually life on other planets? But there is this question about, again, is Jesus there to save people or entities, not just if there are humans eventually living on those other planets, but what about if there is intelligent life on other planets? Do they need to be saved by Jesus? This is not a question that we have to be posed with as Jews. So one could make the argument that if Jews go to other planets, and we would say now the assumption would be that at some point in the future, Jews will be on other planets, then the question will really be, how do we practice Judaism on other planets? But before we get to that question, before we get to the question of what about when we live on other planets, let's also explain that part of what allowed human beings to explore this planet was the Jewish fascination and um, not just fascination, but dependence on the stars. And that is because Jewish law is so important to us, and observing Jewish traditions is so important to us, and many of them are time bound. Many of them are based on days of the week. Many of them are based on the phases of the moon. Many of them are based on where, in some cases, the stars and the planets are in the heavens so that we can assess time. We have always looked to the stars for guidance in understanding time. To some extent, the Torah tells us that right in Genesis, because the Torah says at the beginning in Genesis chapter 1 that the stars are there to help mark time. They're there to help us understand time. And so, because Jews had to know this information, they spent a lot of time studying astronomy. They studied the astronomy of their neighbors, whether they were Greek or Babylonian or Egyptian or Arab. And they always were collecting the most up to date information on what was known about how to measure time, and then, of course, how to navigate by the stars. And one of the most important navigators, or I would say scholars or formulators of of cartography and navigation, was this guy Hasdai Crescus, who lived in Spain. And many of the people who lived in Spain and Portugal before the expulsion, before the Inquisition, there were several very important Jews who helped create the navigational systems that the Spanish and Portuguese sailors used to navigate the world. And so those implements, those astrolabes, and those things that were used to help navigate were oftentimes created by Jewish astronomers. So our fascination and our need to know as much as we could about and to synthesize that information really helped us become excellent teachers of navigation. Now, we now, of course, know that Columbus himself was the descendant, and I would say both of his parents were Sephardic Jews that had gone into exile to get away from Spain. They settled in Genoa in Italy, but most of his crew were people who were also conversos, people who had been forced to convert to Christianity. His navigators, the people who were his translators, his chief translator, Luis de Torres, literally converted just to get on the ship and he was chosen because he knew Aramaic, he knew Hebrew. When Columbus thought he was going to the Indies and to India, sailing that direction, he figured there would be people there who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, and so they wanted to have someone who spoke those languages as well, which is why Luis de Torres went. Luis de Torres, by the way, got off in the New World and never went back to Spain. He took it as a one-way ticket. We don't know what happened to him. Might have died, might have married into the community, the indigenous communities in Hispaniola, Dominican Republic or Cuba. He might have. There might be people floating around those islands who are descendants of Luis de Torres, but we do know that he got away from there as quickly as possible. So many of these people who were sailing, partly to get away from the Spanish Inquisition, several of these people were Jewish and had been steeped in navigation and in cartography because of their need as Jews to understand the stars. So what's so interesting is that our desire to understand the heavens actually during the Middle Ages led to tremendous scientific help that was provided by the Jewish community. So what's interesting is that our need for this on a religious level became became a way for people to help navigate the world and by extension again to discover the new world. So moving forward a little bit, we get to the modern when we get to the modern era of science. Needless to say, some of the most important pioneers in understanding the universe, the most important, of course, being Albert Einstein, were Jewish and were proud of their Judaism and used their Judaism to some extent uh, as a way to some extent justify their curiosity. Obviously, several of the people who were eventually very involved with the atom bomb, including Oppenheimer and Teller, and a lot of the people that were part of that team, which were where it was in the Oppenheimer movie, they referenced it. Were people whose own families were being murdered in Europe at the time. Richard Feynman, who was also from a Jewish background and was raised, by parents who, depending on again how you would understand the way they kind of, well, let's put it this way. His Judaism definitely affected his trajectory because he actually didn't get into a major university because he was part of that quota system. I don't want to dwell on it too much on Feynman, but there were so many Jewish um, scientists, physicists, people that were working in the early 1900s through through this most modern era of astrophysics who were Jewish, that the science was almost dominated by completely dominated by Jews. And the people who've looked at that and said, why? One of the reasons is that our tradition, our faith encouraged people to want to know more about the deeper questions that 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 are the metaphysical questions, the questions that get to cosmological issues of where does the universe come from? How do we understand God? And that is one of the things that inspired Einstein, who I have several books here on my shelf about Einstein, was a deeply, again, not a observant Jew, though he was actually more observant than his own parents. He actually decided as a young person to keep kosher, which he didn't do his whole life, but his parents never kept kosher. But he did believe that, as he famously said, that God doesn't play dice with the universe, that there was not random, the universe is not just a random occurrence. And he balanced a belief in a higher power with this understanding that we have to know more, that God didn't create a universe for us not to study and not to explore. And it led to he openly talked about how this led to his own desire to understand the mind of God. And for him, it was a spiritual quest. So when we think about the modern scientists, they're part of this same legacy of looking to the heavens, being inspired, and saying, how can we know more? How can we understand God? And so um, again, this is an Orthodox thing that I have up here on the screen. Um, this is from Aisha Torah, and when we talk about people who are now actively looking to this question of life on other planets, when we talk about the study of of life beyond Earth, exobiology, and some of these new sciences. Look at the last line here. New insights into the wonders of the universe can bring us a step closer to greater love and understanding of God. Now, again, this is from a an Orthodox from an Orthodox um, site. This is a I mean, Aish does a lot of very, kind of they're on the they're very they're very integrated into the modern world. They do a lot of stuff online. They've adapted a lot of modern technology, but it's a traditional organization. It's an organization that's orthodox, and that's something you have to understand. That even amongst the most orthodox, these are not questions that are scary to us. These are not ones that we're closing off. And remember, that's not the case in every tradition. Galileo was excommunicated by the church. They've since apologized. They've they've since said they were wrong. But Galileo, who was a Catholic, good Italian guy who wanted to go to church, wasn't allowed to go to church. He actually was a little bit more serious than that. He was actually spent some time in jail, but or under house arrest. But this is not the case. This is not the case in Judaism, where the biggest issue now that's going on in the more orthodox within the more orthodox world is how would we adapt to life on other planets. And so we actually have Jewish organizations that are spending their resources and their energy on asking those questions, right? What would the Jewish calendar look like in outer space? How do we keep track of time as Jews in outer space? If you're on Mars and the day is not exactly the same length of time, do you do a bris after 8 days on Mars, or do you do it after what would be 8 days on planet Earth? These types of halakhic questions, these type of legal questions, are questions that are being discussed now in the Orthodox world. And I want to play you a quick clip of something here. Um, yeah, Elise just put up that Richard Feynman was teaching at Caltech when Gordon was a student there. He was also playing the drums. Man, this guy was. There's a great if you like Freakonomics, Stephen Dubner, who I definitely recommend. He does a great podcast. I love Freakonomics. They just did a whole Feynman series, and yeah, he said Feynman sounds like he was just amazing, like a amazing personality. Uh, but yeah, I mean, there's question. I mean, he considered himself an atheist, Feynman, but he was so Jewish, and he talked like such. He actually, some people say he overdid his New York accent, but that would be an amazing guy. Yes, Gordon went to Caltech, so that is something that's very cool. But here, I'm going to show you a little bit about um, these questions and these questions that were. This is a short clip of Fiddler on the Moon, which is again a PBS is available on PBS. You can watch it. I'm going to post a link.
Rabbi,
Yeah, yeah,
that if you go back to that last page,
yeah.
that last sentence above the sentence you read,
Uh-huh.
that's pretty, I like that. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, let me put it back up one sec. Let me just get that back up here. Um the Rebbe, yeah, this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'm going to show you something from the Lubavitcher Rebbe in a second. Uh the Rebbe reply. So it was asked whether there would be a life on Mars. What the Rebbe, so this one guy who was an Orthodox guy asked the Rebbe whether he should be studying. He says, Dr. Green, look for life on Mars. And if you don't find it there, look somewhere else in the universe for it. Because for you to sit here and say there is no life outside of planet Earth is to put limitations on the Creator, and that is not something any of his creatures can do. Yeah. It's interesting. Again, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that, and it's something that, again, in the Orthodox world, is not something we're going to close off the potential for there to be life on other planets or for us to have these kind of questions. So this is a little bit of Fiddler on the Moon. We're going to watch. Oh no, my the part that I had queued up went away, but I want to. I'll show you. I think I found it. Yeah, here it is. It is about the Rebbe. So, but it's not the same issue. Here we go. Let me get this up here. Hold it. This goes back to the 1960s, to when human beings first went on, um, first went on the moon. Hold it a second. You know what I'm going to do? Hold it. Give me 1 sec. Okay. Okay, here we go. See if I can get it now.
The flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar.
There were Jewish newspapers writing, this is not good, and man doesn't belong in space.
They say, well, isn't there a verse in King David's book, the Psalms, Hashemayim,
Shemayim Lashem, the heavens, Shemayim, those are for God, the Haaretz Natan Livnei Adam.
But man has to stick to earth.
In Genesis, retold in paintings, movies, God crafted Adam, from the Adamah, from the earth, from the ground itself. We are literally earthlings. So why would we leave? Are we even allowed to leave?
The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, was asked in the 1960s by journalists, well, what does Judaism have to say?
נקודה נוספת שהתמקדנו בה הייתה השאלה האם יש בחקירת האדם את הטבע ואת החלל סתירה לתורה ולהלכה. הוא אמר לי לחלוטין לא, הוא אמר ככל שההתקדמות מתרחבת בטכנולוגיה של המדע וכל זה, ככה מתבררת אמיתותה של התורה.
It's our duty to go out and to learn and to probe and to explore. Because when we do that, we come to a deeper understanding of God.
When NASA put out a call for applications to be a space shuttle astronaut, my mother didn't like it at all. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, like my two brothers and my father. You know, Jeff, some people have a PhD and an MD. I said, Mom, not going to happen. I was selected as the first group of space shuttle astronauts, a group of 35 back in 1978. Judaism is part of my culture, which is why I brought a lot of Jewish ceremonial objects on flights with me. My very first flight was during Passover, and the woman in charge of our food didn't know what matzah was. She picked it up and she cracked it, and of course, crumbs all over the place. Crumbs are a real problem in space.
Okay, so I'm going to encourage you to watch a little bit of that. It's really quite good. It's not very long. It's 30 minutes. It's a 30-minute little episode. But Jeffrey Hoffman is somebody who I got to meet. It was somebody who my father, did a little. He did several things with him. And I think Jeffrey actually gave him something once that he brought into space, which I wish I had. But he became really close with Jeffrey. They were roughly the same age, and Jeffrey made several journeys into space. I talked about it, as I mentioned, in 2006. that we ended up also, my dad became close with Elon Ramon, and they became very close, even though Elon was from Israel and he spent less time with him than he did with Jeffrey. They became very, very close. Elon was very nice, and my dad really wanted him to get as much out of the experience of being in America as possible. So he came to our house in my dad's house in November for Thanksgiving, which was about 6 weeks, 5 weeks before he went up. The Columbia went up in 2000 and the January 16th, 2003 is when it went up. So November, end of November was Thanksgiving. So it was only about 5 weeks, 6 weeks before 7 weeks before he went, but in reality, it was only about 3 weeks before he had to go into isolation because astronauts have to go into isolation about a month before, 4 weeks or 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks before they go into the shuttle. They go into isolation so they don't get sick while they're there. So they basically monitor them, and so he was within a week or two of that. He was like going 2 weeks. He wasn't going to see his family. So we were there at the launch, my dad and I. They did not put us with the family. We didn't go up ever for Hoffman's journeys, but we did go for Elon's. And because it was in 2003, they had already had the Challenger disaster. They didn't they We weren't seated with the families of the astronauts. The astronaut families were in a separate area. They didn't want people there to take pictures and to watch the families, in case what happened at Challenger where it blew up at takeoff. They didn't want people to intrude on it because that's what happened. When Challenger went up, the people took pictures of the family members watching their families die. So they don't want that. They didn't want that anymore. So we weren't with the family. We were with the family the day before, but not for the launch. So, because they had a big party with the Israeli government, and there was a bunch of people that were there the night before. Obviously not Elon, but everybody who came there to be there were there the day before, but not during the launch. And we were so happy when the launch took place, and nothing happened, that we were like, oh, this is great. This is going to be. And we didn't know that the damage that was done to the space shuttle at the liftoff as it was going up was gonna cause it to be destroyed on return. So we didn't know that. I mean, we didn't realize it. Everything looked good, and so we had no idea. And obviously, they didn't know at NASA that what we had watched was actually the destruction of the way that it could ever come back. But we just thought everything was good. So that was a horrible feeling to know that it was going to be like that. And it was also very reminiscent. And I had a chance to talk to him. I didn't know him well, but I did have a chance to meet Judith Resnick's father. Judith Resnick was on the Challenger, so we lost two astronauts, Jewish astronauts, uh, on both the Challenger and Columbia. Judith Resnick was the first Jewish American to go up on a space shuttle. Judith Resnick was also one of the first women. She was second after Sally Ride to be able to go into space. So she was able to go. Excuse me one second. She was able to go into space.
No, this thing keeps cutting out.
Um, Sorry. So Judith was the first Jewish American in space. There was a Russian Jewish astronaut, a cosmonaut, but she was the first Jewish American, and she was the second woman. And she was actually in that picture that when Hoffman was showing his astronaut group, there was a picture of Resnick. I saw her down below. So was McBride and several of the people who died on the Challenger. So I had always thought that Hoffman, was a hero because anybody who was going to go up into space was risking their lives. And I know, in talking with Judith Resnick's father, he was very proud of her, but any parent who loses their child, this is devastation. And to have it happen in front of everybody. I mean, it's all compounded. It was all bad, but these people are heroes, and we forget because so many of the space missions that we've had have gone without problems. But when it goes bad, it goes horrifically bad, and there's no margin. There's not like we're going to have a little accident in space. It's going to be something like that. And so we have a couple of Jewish, I would say, martyrs, in Judith Resnick and Ilan Ramon, who to some extent gave their lives so that we could explore and know more about space. I mean, we can make the argument that for the last 45 years, 50 years, that our ambitions in space have not been as grand as they should be. But things are changing. I mean, we're seeing both on the right and left a desire for funding and a desire, if not even if it's funded, but through some of the corporations now and some of these, obviously you have Bezos, you have Elon Musk, you have the billionaires and now trillionaires who are spending money on space exploration, that maybe through private funding, that'll be the way that we really are able to do this. It of course limits the amount of government control that happens on that, but maybe that's the sacrifice we have to make in order to accelerate our exploration, because it's definitely not been there. And that was kind of really one of the things that I said in my sermon 20 years ago, that I lamented, was the fact that we weren't spending the necessary funds, and we weren't being inspired. And for us as Jews, we look up into the heavens and we say, look, let's be there. Let's learn more about the universe. That this is something that we should be doing. And I think it helps us as humanity to see beyond the borders. And again, I don't want to get too sermonic about it, because that might be a sermon in the future. That there really is this understanding that perhaps out of this planet we can see beyond the things that that keep us from being able to get along here. The famous scenes, in the sci-fi movies, where whether it's Independence Day or whatever, the movie where people don't there's no longer any need for nations or national identity, because we're humanity fighting against the aliens, or the Star Trek vision that you know that who cares about the divisions that we have on our planet, because we have bigger things going on with the United Federation of Planets, right? We've got Klingons and Romulans, and we've got to bring everybody together in space. So this idea of maybe finding common humanity, through space exploration, and through what might be, again, seen beyond the divisions on the planet. Which then, of course, I want to mention, as we come back to Star Trek, and we come back to the visions of the future. That's really where we turn to science fiction. That's where we turn to some of the great visions of this. And again, some of it we'll talk about when we get to comic books. One of the earliest, most famous explorations into what aliens would be like was created by two Jewish teenagers, right? Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman. And then their first iteration of Superman was not the savior of humanity. He was a villain. Some people don't know that, but their first vision of Superman was not good Superman. But the idea that maybe there would be, if you will, a messianic type person that would come from another planet does come about in their other versions of it. And of course, some people have pointed to the Hebrew origins of some of the names, like Kal-El. Anything with the name El at the end is obviously the name of God, Jor-El. But we'll talk about that more when we get to comic books. But Jewish contributions to science fiction, to imagining what other worlds would be like, and what the future might be like. The the level of Jewish contributions to this, both science fiction and what we call maybe speculative fiction. There's so many Jews that were involved in it from the earliest days, and really, I would say one of the most important and one of the pioneers of science fiction and speculative fiction was Isaac Asimov, and Isaac Asimov was very interested in what would happen with robots. I mean, iRobot was one of his creations, one of the products of his imagination. But of course, the Foundation series and thinking about humanity and the future of humanity, what that would be like, not just you know, not just on the level of looking at it from um, the minor ways that we look at it as humanity, but like a macro picture in the Foundation, which of course now has been turned into a series on Apple TV. But Isaac Asimov was really so ahead of his time on that. But he was also very interested in the Bible, and he wrote a couple of commentaries on the Bible that he was also inspired by, not from the standpoint of he was a religious Jew, like many science fiction writers and like many Jewish proponents of science, was not a, was maybe even in some ways an atheist, but they were deeply inspired by their Jewish tradition. They were deeply inspired by their Jewish history, and and Isaac Asimov was one. I also had the interesting. Didn't have a lot of interaction with him, but before he passed away, I had a chance to meet one of the other early Jewish science fiction writers, Harlan Ellison, who actually adapted iRobot, Isaac Asimov's story, into the movie iRobot. But Harlan Ellison worked with Gene Roddenberry on Star Trek. He worked with lots of people in Hollywood, and Harlan Ellison was the cousin actually of one of our congregants, and so I got to meet him a few times, and he was an interesting guy, and he had a chance to. He was also proud of his Jewish identity. Again, he wasn't especially observant, but he was from Cleveland. He was a part of the Cleveland Jewish community, and he was definitely inspired by his some of his visions were of the future were inspired by his past and by the experiences that he had grown up Jewish in the Midwest. Robert Silverberg was one of the really important Jewish science fiction writers of the past years. Robert Sheckley, um, David Brin, people whose books were in some cases turned into movies. Um, and I would say that as Jews were writing science fiction and also creating, I mean, you can make the argument that one of the greatest creators of science fiction is not a writer, but a director and a producer is Steven Spielberg. And he's been fascinated by space and by extraterrestrials and by what um, what that means to us as human beings in a way that I think, as a storyteller, and I've never met Spielberg, but if I do, I'd really tell him, thank you for using these stories, not just your science fiction and of course, so many of your stories, tell bigger stories about humanity. But it's really special that some of these really inspiring stories have been written by Jews, and I think to some extent have been either the imprint of the Torah stories, or also the imprint of Jewish experience, Jewish history. I think is significant. You know, Getting back to and the crossover, by the way, too, with with uh, with those um, who've popularized space. One of the things that Carl Sagan wrote years ago was, and by the way, I want to also tell you, so there are other Jewish astronauts who've participated in the U.S. Space program, and Israel, also has launched it on its own and in combination with the United States has launched quite a few satellites. There's Israeli satellites out there that Israel has always been on ever since it could afford to, has been at the forefront of using science and space exploration. The first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, was a scientist, and the Weizmann Institute in Israel is one of several institutes in Israel that is always looking towards the future. But when we think about what happens again in the United States and also in other parts of the world, um, it's oftentimes Jews who say, our history, our experience is something that it can inspire humanity and to some extent make us um, make us better here on this planet, whether you or I ever get off this planet, that we can be inspired by and live better lives because of it. So this was from the sermon that I gave on 2006. I quoted Carl Sagan, and he wrote a book called Pale Blue Dot, which is a vision of the human future in space. And I'd say it's still pretty, it holds up pretty well. It holds up pretty well because even though some of the science has advanced, hasn't advanced that much, unfortunately, partly because we haven't done that much. We haven't explored enough, and we're only going to learn by exploring. We're only going to learn by trial and error. But it's also because he was talking about the bigger picture. And I want to share with you something that he wrote that, again, whether this comes through in religious traditions or in some cases in the values. This is what he wrote about his own grandparents, the Grubers, Jewish immigrants to America. Having in all their lives till then crossed nothing wider than a river, Lieb and Chaya graduated to crossing oceans. They had one great advantage. On the other side of the waters, they would be invested with outlandish customs. It is true, other human beings speaking their language and sharing at least some of their values, even people to whom they were closely related. In our time, we've crossed the solar system and sent ships to the stars, but there are no distant relatives, no humans, and apparently no life waiting for us on those other worlds. No letters conveyed by recent emigres help us to understand the new land. Only digital data transmitted at the speed of light by unfeeling, precise robot emissaries. They tell us that these new worlds are not much like home. But we continue to search for inhabitants. We can't help it. Life looks for life. So, not necessarily, again, a deeply religiously observant person, but what a deeply Jewish statement. Because Judaism, which values life so much, that will inspire us when we get to other planets, or to get to other planets. So, where are we going to be another 20 years from now? Well, I hope the discussion will have progressed a little bit further. I hope that we'll be able to say, yeah, now we've got somebody living on another planet. It's Mars. It's really close by, but we have people living there now. All of those things are going to be hopefully steps. But remember something. Our ancestor Avraham was a Hebrew. Not exactly sure where the word comes from, but we believe that it comes from the word ever, the one who crossed over. Now, Avraham crossed over from a land he didn't know, right? In Lech Lecha, we're told, God tells him to go to a land that's not your homeland. It's not where you came from. Leave your father's house. And so Avraham is the first Jew, and he's the first person in our people to make a journey, to go to a new place, to go to a place where he didn't know what he was going to find there. He had to have faith that he was going to find something there. But he dreamt, or he was told, he had the prophecy that his ancestors, that his descendants would be Kochavei Hashemayim, that they will be as numerous as the stars in the heavens, and maybe even one could translate that they will find themselves amongst the stars in the heavens. And I can tell you that if there are people in the future on other planets, some of them are going to be our people, and that's for sure. And they will have to answer those questions. How do we pray towards Jerusalem? How do we keep track of when Passover is? There are going to be Jews who are going to be asking those questions. I can tell you that without a doubt. So let's hope. Let's hope it's sooner rather than later. Let's hope that the journey to those places will be not as fraught with disaster as much of our exploration has been up until now. It seems like the best laid plans always, you know, always need to be reevaluated and understood that it takes a lot of faith to do these journeys. And I hope we have that faith, and I know there'll be people who will have that faith because there'll be people who will risk their lives to do these journeys. So
I hope women will be included.
I hope
So I'm
so.
not so sure right now.
I think that Esther, I think not only will women be included, but I think we might find that women might be physically more adaptable to some of these things than men. We don't know. One of the things that's in that video, that Fiddler on the Moon, is they actually talk with one of the Jewish women who's an astronaut. Very interesting story about some of the Jewish women who are astronauts, and also some of the Jewish women who have gone into the training for long-term journeys. And there's a couple of um, of trials where people basically have gone into they've gone into these modulars, they're kind of trial. They're basically what you'd find on Mars. If you saw the movie, Matt Damon's movie, The Martian, it's those type of habitations that they'll set up in Mars. So they've set some of them up in the desert, in some parts of the world, and they do studies on what happens to people when they're in close quarters for a long period of time. Obviously, we've been doing those studies up at the International Space Station, but they've also tried to not just do it in space in zero gravity, but what it's like on a planet. So they've set up these essentially pretend simulated environments. And so one of the women that they talked to on Fiddler on the Moon is one of these women who did this, who had to go into this simulation. So it's an interesting thing. I think there will definitely be women, and I think some of them will have really interesting things to say. Actually, too, one of the newest science fiction writers, I did not mention her because she doesn't have the same canon that Isaac Asimov does, but there's a woman who wrote a book which was very popular. Unfortunately, they've not really been able to adapt it. They've kind of come up with against the wall in adapting it. Is a book called The Sparrow. Is anybody a big science fiction aficionado? The woman who wrote its name is Maria. I can't remember right now. Maria Russell, something Russell, and she's actually a convert to Judaism. Um, she was raised Catholic and converted to Judaism, but a few years after she wrote it, Mary Doria Russell, and the book's called The Sparrow. It won the Arthur C. Clarke Award for science fiction, and it was a very religious book. But it's really about Jesuits going to another planet and kind of doing what they have done in other parts of the world. And it's kind of like one of those stories about, you know, people who've gone to Japan or gone to South America and what they faced as they try to convert the natives. So yeah, it's called The Sparrow. Um, but she's one of the women who's got who has written some really impressive science fiction. There's also I think one of the greatest books about what the future might look like, and also um, um, it's kind of a modern version of um, the Golem, which we just came back from. We just came back from Prague. Definitely thinking still about the Golem. This is a book that came out called He, She, and It. It came out in 1991. Also, by the way, won the Arthur C. Clarke Award um, in '93. And yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to recommend a book by Mary Doria Russell that I read many years ago called Dreamers of the Day.
Okay.
Dreamers.
What's it about?
It's not science fiction, but it's about, there's a little bit about the afterlife, but it's about the Cairo conference of 1924.
Mhm. Interesting.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting book. And I am familiar with the Sparrow as well. She's a good writer.
Yeah. So this, I'll bring that up right now, but I just want to, right. This story, He, She, and It, um, she really nailed, by the way, this writer, Marge Piercy, she really nailed some of what this takes place in 2059, not too far away now, but she really nailed some of what happens with cyberspace. So I guess it's considered a cyberpunk book. I don't even think they called it cyberpunk, but you know, that's William Burroughs. That's the style of science fiction that this has kind of been put together with, but it's really wild. And I thought it was a pretty good book. So again, to talk about some of the, let me just bring up Mary Dor. Uh, I'll bring up the book that Philip was talking about. So yeah, there are some really important Jewish women in science fiction, and as I said, some very important Jewish women astronauts too. But yeah, here's Mary Doria Russell. She converted to Judaism in '93, so that was just before. So she keeps kosher. This was just before she wrote the Sparrow. Children of God. That's the one you were talking. No, that's the sequel to this. What was the name of the book you mentioned, Philip?
Dreamers of the Day.
Dreamers of the Day. So
Yeah.
it is right here. Dreamers of the Day. Historical romance set in the Midwest in the aftermath of First World War. Okay, there you go. Cairo Convention. So
Yeah.
I will take a look at that. So yeah, I think it's important to talk about those women writers as well who have who've inspired who've inspired us. And again, you know, some of it I would say some of it is you know grand sci-fi of other planets and those kind of things. Obviously, the Foundation is about humanity living amongst many planets, but that really wasn't the focus on it. Was focus was there was on bigger philosophical issues in the Foundation series. But no, this guy wrote David Brin wrote this book, which became a very marginal movie, but people really liked the book. It's a post-apocalyptic story, uh, The Postman, which of course became a movie with Kevin Costner, but it was yeah, it was a pretty popular book when it came out, And I spoke to him not long after the movie came out. He was not real happy with the way that the movie came out, but yeah, that's another. But again, I mean, there's so many Jewish science fiction writers, so many people that have kind of used, um, you know, I would say, and David's father, Herb, was a publisher of a Jewish newspaper here in LA, The Heritage, which was a competitor of my dad's for many years. But he was very involved in the Jewish community and grew up, um, the Jewish community. I think again, even for people who are not religious or religiously observant, that their Jewish experiences both as kind of like what the Jewish values are, but also in some cases, I think for David, this is a little bit about what happens if kind of militia, people become pop in power. That kind of gets to some of maybe like what we fear as Jews, that there's going to be mobs of anti-Semitic neo Klansmen that are going to be running around the country. So those are definitely like part of our. If you want to know what the Jewish fears are, and again in Marge Piercy's book, it's that Israel has been obliterated by a nuclear bomb, and so Israel has is there's a post-Israel I entity, if you'd call it. And so these are, sometimes those fears make their way into Jewish fiction as well. Or we would say Jewish science fiction.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you mentioned Harlan Ellison. I just wanted to mention he wrote what was arguably the best Star Trek episode ever, and most people agree with that. Um,
Yeah. Uh,
City
you're
on the Edge.
you're talking about sitting on the edge of
I mean, I don't know. Even the other iterations of Star Trek, I don't think anyone's come up with a better script.
it was definitely one of the best.
But
I think one of the best, and I actually mentioned it in my sermon. One of my favorite ones is The Enemy Within, because it is about the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara. It's about this concept in Judaism that we have we have within us good and bad, and we need both sides uh, in order to exist. It's very Jewish, a very Jewish concept, and to me, that episode all that episode always stayed with me as a very, kind of a very a very Jewish concept. The
so,
guy who the guy who wrote it, uh, the guy who wrote that episode was actually Richard Matheson, who wrote a lot of really great science fiction as well. But he was not Jewish.
so
But
my
yeah.
question is to you: was Star Trek a Jewish television series?
Well, oh, by the way, one of the other people who did work on the that episode, The Enemy Within, the director of it was a guy by the name of Leo Penn. And Leo Penn was a Jewish director. He was also the father of Sean Penn. So yeah, he was Jewish, but he didn't write the episode. Anyways, I believe that Star Trek, and again, that's one of the reasons why I kind of did that sermon on Star Trek, was I do believe that the show has some very Gene Roddenberry is not Jewish, but I think that the values and a lot of what was part of the mythology and the foundation of it. And again, it wasn't just because William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy were Jewish. And of course, Leonard Nimoy introduced the Spock blessing, the Vulcan salute from the priestly blessing. I mean, he talked about it. That's not a question, that's where the live long and prosper came from, was from the Kohanim. But that you could say is more of the like the weird Jewish trivia of it. But I do think that the overwhelming feelings and the values of it were definitely Jewish. This idea that humanity could come together and work together, people of all different backgrounds, is 100% a Jewish idea. And it wasn't that the people excuse me, that they all had to be Jewish in order to, they weren't. They were all their ethnicities, they were all these different nations. And that is something that Judaism has as a vision. The vision of Isaiah is that all these people are working together, all these people are living in peace, that they're turning their swords into plowshares. This idea, uh, this idea is definitely a Jewish idea. It's not, you don't have to be Jewish to have those ideas, but I do think that the value of humanity coming together. I mean, look, they don't touch on religion in Star Trek, or at least human religions. They made a conscious effort not to have religion be a be there. There were definitely traditions that were shown in the show, whether it was Vulcan traditions, or traditions on other planets that they went to. There definitely were religious elements in some of those cultures. But at least within human beings, there was this idea that humanity had kind of become post-religious. I would say that there were definitely some science fiction writers and some futurists in the Jewish community who kind of also, to some extent, would hope that at some point, I'm not saying that Isaac Asimov was one of those, but there were definitely ones who were very much, of the mindset of kind of the socialist idea that, yeah, we can leave religion behind and transcend these ideas in the future. And I think that was probably, that was definitely something that you saw in Roddenberry's vision of that. So I think that, the fact that there's not a Jewish, that there's a Scottish guy and a Japanese guy and an African woman, but would there be a Jewish guy? No, there could have been an Israeli guy maybe, but they didn't get that in. They kept very simple on their ethnicities, and I think that was intentional. They trying to show a post-religious future was something that Star Trek and other futurists, including, like I said, Jewish futurists, kind of were more than okay with. But again, I would also tell you that there are people like Einstein who are very proud of their Jewish identity, and they were proud of their connection to Israel and to this idea that Jews are unique people that have something to offer as Jews. So I think that I will almost guarantee that if we make major strides in space, Israel is going to be at the forefront of that. And I think I think if you, it's going to happen, and and some of the technology that Israel's already developed is going to be, you know, it's going to be an integral part of the science that brings us to other planets. So, without a doubt, Israelis are going to have a disproportionate role in space exploration, and I would bet in space colonization. And of course, we'll be colonizers. We'll be we'll be colonizers in space. The Jews are colonizing space. Will be the next charge, is that we're colonizing space. But I'm pretty sure that we're going to be doing it in conjunction with the United States and with other nations that are going to cooperate together. And think about it, by the way. Look, we've had minor versions of that. The International Space Station was for so many years had Russian participation and European participation. So we we do we try to we've tried in the past to really put kind of a pan humanity, we've tried to put it into existence.
But anti-Semitism is going into space. Remember Marjorie Taylor Greene and her claim of Jewish space lasers.
Yes, but you heard what happened. Israel is developing space lasers, so they said maybe she's right. No, they did. They recently said, yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene is right. We are putting up space lasers. I think I'm kidding. I'm just going to finish with this. Uh, Israel is working on space lasers. So now I'm going to say they're mainly for mainly for defense, but yeah, no, she said it, and uh, they yeah, no, this just happened recently, Philip, that Israel acknowledges that that now she said we were using it to control the weather and do other stuff, but and then she walked it back. Then she said it wasn't true. But no, there was just recently an Israeli lawmaker um, acknowledged it that we are working on it.
And I was only semi cynical when I said about whether there'll be women astronauts, since today they're talking about to join the military. They're going to test they have to check your testosterone.
I know. Well, no, that's not. They didn't say they were going to test it. They said they were encouraging people in there who are over 30.
Yes, that helps the women in the military. I know.
So I will tell you though that it is definitely something that Israel will be taking a lead here. It was here. I'll just share this when we go out. We can go out to this. This is not the most. He's not the most popular of politicians necessarily in Israel now, but he is the defense minister. And this was help me out here. I think it was like a week ago. I'm not joking. No, June 29th. So yeah, it was 2 weeks ago. So Israel was committed to becoming the leading player with capabilities to attack from space. So there you go. There's our Jewish space lasers. But I thought he actually had said something that like Marjorie Taylor Greene is right. Like I thought he said something like that, but maybe that was somebody goofing on it. But yeah, it's going back to let's see if this is the rest of it. No, I going back to where we started. Jews in space. Maybe we'll be using lasers to knock down the incoming attacks that we deal with, and who knows, this might be something that we share with America, that Israel shares with the Americans, right? So let's hope that.
Speaking of Jews in space, I have been in space twice. Well,
What?
not physically, but two of the devices which I designed were launched by NASA. One was launched in
Fantastic.
78, and the other one was launched in 81 or 82. And I designed the onboard computer and data transmission system for what was called then the HEO-B. It was later called the Einstein Observatory, which I thought was incredibly wonderful. And then HEO-3, because they got rid of the letters, they went to numbers. HEO-3, both of them were in geosynchronous orbit. Both of them were studying things like pulsars, quasars, and so on. They were both loaded with astronomical instruments in the X-ray and then transmitted the resulting data back to Earth. I don't know what has happened to HEO-3, but I know HEO-B, the Einstein Observatory, when it finally outlived its usefulness, was crashed into the sea, and I really wanted the parts back.
Well, you never know. Maybe we'll make some inquiries. I'm sure by now the classified nature of the stuff has got to have gone away. But thank you for doing that.
It took
very cool.
HEO-B took 3 good-sized circuit boards to build that onboard computer, and I could now do it probably in a board 1.5 by 1.5 inches and do the work in less than a week as opposed to 4 months. So technology has changed.
Excellent. Well, we are over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at Jewish music, Jewish film and TV, and the contributions of Jews to those things. And then, of course, Jews and comics and graphic novels. So we're going to talk a little bit about Spielberg and some of those other people who've made contributions to Jewish and to the general media and the interaction and the interplay of those. But in the coming weeks, we're going to hopefully have a little bit of fun with this. I mean, look, this is a very serious topic in a sense too. This is also this is the future, but it also, there is something here which is inspiring, but also gets to some entertainment as well. So that will be in the future. We'll talk about Mel Brooks a little bit. And by the way, one of the things that his legacy is that his son Max was the director, the writer of World War Z, which became very successful zombie fiction and movie with Brad Pitt and others, and a very important scene in that movie about Israel and the Yom Kippur War and what Israel has learned from it. But yeah, they're Mel Brooks's son has also been part of Jewish science fiction and I guess you could say Jewish film as well. So again, we look forward to seeing you all. Thank you everybody for being here. It's great to be back. Next week we will see you, and maybe we'll see you tomorrow in Marston's. Some of us are going to go there, and I'm going to be there for lunch. Some people will be there for breakfast. Some people will be there for dinner. Some people will be there all three. I think John Stolman's going to camp out there and have all his meals there. And, so go by and see John. But and then of course on Friday night we'll have Rick and Addie for Shabbat, and the following Friday we're going to have our next. We have two candidates for the associate rabbi. The next one, Malka Hamer, will be there on the 24th to be there for her audition. It's not really audition, but a chance for us to see her and to learn about her and to see her lead services. That's the 24th of July. And then the next night will be at Alta AV. So for coming back around for soccer, if you want to see a soccer game, and Lewis, we're going to be in your backyard. We're going to be out in Lancaster for a soccer game on the 25th on that Saturday night. We're going to be there for the Alta AV game, and so there's a lot of good stuff on the horizon. We're going to have our Beach Havdalah on August 1st, which will be here before you know it. So a lot of good things to be here for, and hopefully we'll see you soon. And maybe, who knows, one day we'll see you in outer space. See you. Dream about it tonight.
Bye, all.
Good night, all. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.